And I now recognize gentleman from Texas, Representative Castro, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And Chair Kim, I appreciated working with you to reintroduce the bipartisan Partner with ASEAN Act today. This bill would give ASEAN the same diplomatic privileges and immunities that other major multilateral institutions already enjoy, a step that I believe would strengthen ASEAN's centrality and U.S. regional ties. So I wanted to ask Mr. Poling, how important is it for the U.S. to follow through on this legislation and demonstrate that we treat ASEAN as a strategic partner?
I think it is quite important, particularly at a time when ASEAN questions whether the U.S. will follow through on a great many commitments it makes. The legislation's been pending for, I think, 3 years. So it first introduced 3 years ago. At a time when ASEAN fears that the U.S. will withdraw from multilateral engagement, at a time when the State Department has suggested that it will shut down the multilateral affairs shop within EAP, which is in charge of ASEAN affairs, this can send an important countervailing message.
Thank you. And I want to ask Dr. Kuok, recent polling suggests that public opinion in the United States has dipped in majority Muslim Southeast Asian countries following Israel's war in Gaza. And so how has the war in Gaza affected the region's public opinion of the United States?
As mentioned earlier, the drop in support for the United States since the recent Gaza crisis has been precipitous in Muslim majority countries, about a 20 percentage point drop in support for the United States since the Gaza crisis. And support for China in Muslim majority countries is averaging about 70% amongst Muslim majority countries. And this was in the most recent poll as well, the 2025 poll. So a slight decrease in support for China and increase in support for the United States, but still very poor support for the United States amongst these Muslim majority countries. Amongst even Singaporean respondents, because Singapore has a minority Muslim population, I think sentiment is also quite bleak about the United States, and it's either inaction or its active support of Israel. And so that has hurt perceptions of the United States. And I think, the poll has most clearly reflected the drop in support for the United States amongst Muslim majority countries, but it hasn't been limited to Muslim majority countries or even the Muslim population. I think the humanitarian crisis is clear for all to see.
And I want to ask you, given those things, what the long-term implications for U.S. credibility and influence in the region are, particularly the longer this goes on.
Mm-hmm. I think how much it impacts the United States' ability to influence the region will depend on the situation in the ground, and the extent to which, I guess, humanitarian aid is able to reach victims of this crisis. So it will wax and wane accordingly. That said, I think countries in the region are very pragmatic. So regardless of that crisis, I think it'll hurt sentiment, but nonetheless, countries will seek to work with the United States. And we see that from, say Malaysia, whose prime minister has been the loudest and most vocal against, in terms of criticizing the United States for its support of Israel. Before Malaysia took up the chair of ASEAN, it actually expressed that it would seek, as ASEAN chair, to work with various important partners. And it mentioned a whole list of partners, but left out the United States. Since then, Malaysia has sought to clarify that it seeks to continue to work with the United States. So I think even then it wants to work with the United States, but the U.S. has to be there to offer up economic and security options.
And speaking of the economic part, I have 45 seconds left. Let me ask you about the effect of the tariffs on public opinion as well, because that's another major issue.
It's unclear at the moment what the effect of the tariffs have been on Southeast Asia. The 2025 poll I mentioned was conducted from early January to mid-February. So before the U.S. Disengagement from Europe, before the U.S. aid cuts, as well as before the tariffs. But I think it cannot but hurt the United States, given the steep tariffs, as I mentioned, on many of the poorest, some amounting to almost 50% a tariff rate. And these countries cannot afford these tariff rates. So it's not only going to have an economic impact on the region, but as the Singapore Prime Minister pointed out, an impact on the global trading system, which will then hurt these countries. And it will hurt the United States as well. It might win a little bit in terms of gain an inch but lose a yard, because in terms of its strategic ability to influence the region and get the region to align with it on issues important to it.
I've just run out of time.
Will be on a back foot. Thank you.
Thank you.